say we go ahead and get started. We've got a few folks signed into the room, and thank you for joining us today. This is, you're at the session from NWEA on remote testing lessons and resources for responding to the COVID-19 slide. If you would advance to the next slide, please. Joining you today to facilitate this session, my name is Brad Banich. I'm a regional manager on NWEA's national accounts team, which is a group of folks here that specialize in serving our charter school partners. And then also joining us from NWEA, we have Adam Wolfgang. He is our product manager for the Map Growth tool and also our lead for remote testing. And Dr. Mike Darlene, who is our manager for our research reporting and data analytics team. So we're very happy to be sharing with you today. Kind of the format that we're going to follow is I will start out by just giving a really quick overview of our Map Growth tool so that if you're not familiar with it, it'll be important for you to have that context as Adam divulges some of the info on remote testing, and Dr. Darlene digs into some of the research behind learning loss and taking action with that. After I share that brief overview of the Map Growth tool, Adam will take lead and lead us through some content around remote testing, what we've done to approach that, ways we've supported our partners, lessons learned from our partners, and so forth. And then the bulk of the presentation will be facilitated by Dr. Darlene, really sharing some on the research that NWEA has been conducting around learning loss related to temporary school closures and how to take action with that data. So we're happy to be here with you today. We'll be monitoring the chat box as well, so if any questions come up, we do have some time designated for Q&A at the end of the session. But if you have any immediate questions, we're happy to address those in the chat box during the session. So, Mike, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, I'll kick us off. So, next slide, please. With Map Growth, if you're not familiar with it, it is a computer-adapted interim assessment. So what that means is that the difficulty level of the test items are adjusting in real time as the student is taking the assessment. So as they answer items correctly, they see more difficult content, and as they answer items incorrectly, they see less difficult content. It will adjust in the moment and adjust to how the student is responding, and it will go where it needs to for that individual student. So there's not any restrictions around only certain grade level items are accessible. It will go as high or as low as it needs to for that individual student. One of the functions of, or I guess I should say the main function of the Map Growth assessment is to really provide you with an authentic achievement level for that student. You know, kind of taking the concept of grade level out of the picture and just looking at raw achievement level, where is the student achieving? And that helps us identify where their zone of proximal development is, where they're ready for instruction, where that area for projective struggle is. And as far as the frequency, with it being an interim assessment, it's designed for our partner schools to administer 3 times during the traditional school calendar. So many of our partners will administer at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. It can also be administered in the summer, and the test itself is untimed. Next slide, please. So this here, this is really just kind of a visual representation of when a student is taking a test, how that operates. And so you can see these green checks and red X's are indicating when the student may respond incorrectly or correctly to test items. And all the test items on the Map Growth test have a RIT value. They're calibrated to our RIT scale, and that RIT value is expressing that item's level of difficulty. So as they are responding to these items, the assessment is analyzing how they've responded to those items and determining items that the student should be presented with next. And what we're really looking to do is to really hone in and refine the difficulty level of those items to match where the student's achievement level is. And so at the end of the assessment, we get what's called a RIT score. And that indicates what the student's achievement level is based on our scale. So when the student takes the assessment over consecutive times, what we get is a RIT score for each of those sessions. So you can see here a sample of a student taking a test, let's say starting from the fall of 2015 up through the winter of 2018, and what their RIT score is and how that changes over time. This is similar in concept to measuring a student's height with a yardstick, perhaps, at various intervals of time, and seeing how that changes over time and seeing how much they're growing. When you're looking at students' height, we have percentiles and norms to see how that relates to what typical growth is or typical height is, and that's the same kind of concept with the MAP growth assessment. We're just doing that from an academic perspective, measuring their achievement level academically at various points in time, seeing how that changes over time, how much they're growing, how that growth relates to the norm or other students, and so forth. Next slide. Thanks, Mike. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to briefly show a couple of the reports that come from the MAP growth assessment. What you're seeing on the screen here is a sample of what's called our student profile, which is like an interactive dashboard that's displaying data from a MAP growth assessment for an individual student. So you can get all that data in one spot for that individual student, such as what their percentiles are for growth and achievement, what their RIT scores are for various instructional areas and which ones should be areas of focus or which ones are relative strength. There's a growth goal setting tool in here, and Michael will be elaborating on setting goals here when he covers his section. And there's this growth over time module that shows all the historical test events and how that's changed over time. Next slide, please. What you're seeing here is an example of our learning continuum, and this kind of relates to what I was describing earlier about identifying the student's zone of proximal development and really understanding what skills and concepts are in that zone of proximal development. So in this particular example, we're looking at the geometry instructional area of mathematics, and the learning continuum tells us what students are in this particular point range. In this example, we're looking at the 181 to 190 score range. And then what skills and concepts are in that range, or thus in the zone of proximal development for those students. Next slide, please. This report here is more of an administrator level report, and it's got a lot of good information on it, but just for high level overview purposes, really, this gives you the opportunity to look at the actual growth of a group of students, perhaps in a particular grade level, and how that relates to what average growth is based on our norms. So if you look at that 8th grade example, you can see the blue bar is surpassing the yellow diamond, which indicates the growth observed for the 8th grade group of students in this school or district surpasses the yellow diamond, which is our norm, what normative growth is. So with that, I'll go ahead and transition over to Adam. Again, my part in this was just to provide a brief overview so that for those of you that are unfamiliar with MAP growth, have some foundational knowledge to really understand the aspects of remote testing that Adam will be speaking to, and when Mike speaks to the research behind learning loss. So Adam, take it away.
Thanks, Brad. We're going to talk a little bit about our approach to remote testing and how we've positioned ourselves to support districts as they attempt to remote test. And it all really started back in March as we learned that schools were going to close due to COVID-19 in the spring. Our recommendation at the time was not to test, and the primary reason behind that was that there were other more important things on the plate for schools to focus on at that point, the health and well-being of their students, but also how to transition into distance learning. And we didn't feel like assessment was an important part of that discussion at the moment. We also recommended not testing at that point so that we could regroup and develop some plans to support it. And this is how we've approached that. Next slide, please, Michael. We've worked with virtual schools, quite a few virtual schools across the country for 7 years or so. And so we leveraged the information we've learned from those schools who are well-versed in remote use of our products. So we interviewed those school districts. We asked them their best practices, how they've managed remote testing over the years, and we converted those best practices to brick and mortar application to try to identify what the main problem statements were going to be that our schools would typically encounter and how we could provide solutions for those problems. Next slide, Michael. So this is what we were hearing for fall, ahead of fall. We were hearing that most schools were going to start the year using 100% distance learning. Most schools were not going to start the year this year in school. But we knew that some schools would start to transition to hybrid attendance models by the end of the fall season. We also heard that virtual school enrollment had spiked, which shows that families were looking for longer term distance learning plans for their students. We had heard that schools mostly had planned to test remotely, that they needed resources to support that alternative test administration, and that each school's plans would have very nuanced differences in what other tools they were going to use to support remote learning, distance learning. So we needed our resources to be able to be flexible enough to fit those nuanced differences. So what we did, next slide please, Michael, we created a website of internal support materials for our school partners. Those materials kind of fit in 3 different buckets. We created guidance and recommendation documents. These were really used to help with planning, to support planning, filled with best practices from our virtual schools, and also recommendations on how to do some of the logistics around managing remote testing. We also provided some proctor support materials. These are really specific for teachers and proctors, checklists, PowerPoint decks, videos, things that we could provide for proctors that would help on the day of testing. And then we provided some school-to-home communication support. So we developed a set of family letters that were editable by districts and schools to give them the ability to have a foundation to build from, to be able to communicate home with their families, what the expectations and process would be for remote testing. Next slide, please, Michael. So the results from fall, we had about 8,400 districts and schools test, 8,400 distinct districts test. So typically we have about 10,000. So we know there are some districts that chose not to test, but the majority of our district partners did indeed do some level of remote testing. 90% of those 8,400 districts did do remote testing in some capacity. Some of them have waited until they've reopened and are doing in-person testing. But most of those districts did some level of remote testing. We've heard some feedback themes from those districts, and they're probably not a big surprise. We're hearing that student login is challenging. Logging students into digital tools, particularly younger students, has been a challenge. We're hearing about device-specific challenges with iPads, challenges with Chromebooks, issues that are specific to those devices that can be overcome, but it's really challenging for teachers to manage the troubleshooting there. And then we're hearing K2 students are getting help from caregivers, from parents, from older brother or sister, from aunts and uncles, whoever may be helping them to take their test in their home. We're seeing the results of them getting some additional help, which is inflating some scores a little bit. That's what we've seen in fall so far. Next slide, please, Michael. As we look forward beyond fall, we're hearing 3 kind of distinct themes. The first one is that we expect up to 20% of families are committed to distance learning indefinitely, regardless of pandemic outcomes. So as schools begin to open back up, we expect up to 20% of families will keep their kids in some sort of distance learning program. And the second theme that we're hearing is a lot of public school districts are considering creating and opening virtual academies within their district in order to support this need. That makes sense. And in some states, we're even hearing that states are providing some additional funding to districts who are opening these virtual schools. We're also hearing that asynchronous learning and digital tools are likely to expand into the classroom. So teachers are more comfortable with tools like Google Classroom. They're more comfortable with tools like a virtual learning platform like Canvas or video conference tools And we're hearing that teachers are interested in recording in classroom lessons and hosting them within digital learning platforms for students to have access to later, either to support studying or even for students who may have missed class to be able to attend. So some of these practices we do expect will continue as schools come back into the building. That's the information we have learned. I hope that was useful to you. Now we're going to transition over to Dr. Deline to continue talking about how we're supporting student COVID slide.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm going to talk about 3 specific resources that NWEA has made available to the school districts with whom NWEA partners. I'm going to talk specifically about the recovery and goal setting data file. I'll talk a little bit and I'll show the Map Growth Goal Explorer. And then I'll talk a little bit about the instructional report. Again, these are 3 resources and 3 tools that are available to schools that work with map growth data, and all of them can be used to try to identify cases where student achievement has dropped off due to issues such as school closures or issues with distance learning. So first, I'm going to talk about the recovery and goal setting data file. This is a new offering to NWEA. It was developed over the summer. When the schools closed in the spring, nearly all of them did not test, as Adam was talking about earlier. And over the summer, we heard from many of the school districts that we work with that they are desperate to have some way of identifying students who may have suffered the greatest academic losses in achievement so that they can be identified and potentially provided with additional resources or interventions as appropriate. And so the recovery and goal setting data file was a tool that has been designed in order to make it easier to identify students who might most benefit from those kinds of additional resources. Specifically, within the file, it provides information about change in test percentile from last year. That is a change in the student's relative standing relative to where they were in the prior academic year. It also provides information about different growth goals that would help to get a student back to where she or he was prior to COVID losses. I'm going to share an example of what that data set looks like. Here is simply just an example of the type. It's a standard flat file. It's accessible through our reporting system. One would request this file in much the same way that one would request a comprehensive data file at the end of a testing term. It provides, but in addition to providing information about students' test scores, provides information about individuals whose change in relative standing, that is the change in their normative test percentile from last school year to this school year, has dropped down significantly. So here are examples. Here's a case of someone who actually increased their achievement percentile. But what it also does is, in addition to identifying those kids who've shown losses in relative standing, provides information about their growth goals. These are the growth projections that we would normally provide in reports. But we also provide examples of what we call 60th percentile growth and then COVID recovery growth. 60th percentile growth is simply a growth projection that is a little bit above average. This is something that would help to increase someone's relative standing if they'd had a little bit of drop in growth. And then the COVID recovery growth projection shows how many points of growth would be required in order to regain one's prior academic relative standing. And then this final field indicates the level of growth that would be required in order to meet that growth goal. So here we see, for example, this in order for this student who had gone from fourth percentile to the first percentile, that student would need to make 24 points of growth in order to regain his or her relative standing, which would require pretty significant growth on that part of that student, 85th percentile growth, which by definition is only about 15% of our norm reference sample would meet or exceed growth at that level. So this is a way, this tool provides a tool that not only shows individuals whose scores have shown the greatest decrease over the closures, but it also provides growth goals oriented around modestly increasing their relative standing, as well as fully regaining any loss that they might have experienced, and also an indicator of the difficulty of meeting that goal. So, for example, an 85th percentile growth goal is one that, as I said just a moment ago, only 15% of students would make. It would probably be wise to set a multi-year goal for the student to regain his or her prior standing, given how difficult it would be to meet that goal in a single academic year. So the access to the recovery goal file is just like any other, is pretty standard. A district or school coordinators enjoy access to that report by logging into teach.nwea.org, then searching for map growth reports under the reports header, and then scrolling down to click on the recovery and goal setting data file. The next tool that I'm going to talk about is not a data file. It's an interactive visual tool. It's accessible directly on NWEA's website. In fact, if one were to just Google Map Growth Goal Explorer tool, it should be the first thing that pops on a Google search. This is a tool designed to support and simplify the goal setting process. It shows a range of possible growth goals against the backdrop of important academic benchmarks. And it's designed to be able to help teachers, families, and students work together to establish goals that strike a balance between what is meaningful and what is realistic. Meaningful in the sense that it allows the individual user to set goals that are aligned to specific academic benchmarks. Realistic in the sense that it provides information about how challenging it would be to hit that growth target within a single school year. So I'm just going to show this is just a screen capture, but I'm going to show how we would interact with the tool. And then if there are questions, I'm happy to actually go to the tool and show people how it would be interacted with. But to start by using the tool, you would simply enter a student's information at the top of the tool, including a student's grade, their state, a fall RIT score, and a subject. Entering that information, you immediately provided with some information about how that student's RIT score compares on our norms. So, for example, in this case, a student with a score of 213 in the 5th grade in fall would be at the 60th percentile, meaning that they scored higher than about 60% of other students in the same grade. Entering those values into the top of the tool populates this figure which provides information about different growth goals that are available or that correspond to the information provided. So, for example, this pink line here shows the average growth. This is the typical growth projection that would appear on any standard NWEA report. This bluish purplish line provides information about the stretch goal. This is the 60th percentile growth goal. And then we also see information about a custom growth goal. In this case, we have entered a custom growth goal value of 226, which corresponds to the college readiness benchmark. So we see this is the student's current location. We see this indicates the typical performance for a student in that grade. This represents typical performance for kids who are on track to be college ready based on that grade. And then this represents the level of performance associated with the state proficiency benchmark for that state. At the bottom of the tool, we see information. We see the projected scores and growth goals that are indicated by these different colored lines. And then we have information about the likelihood what would be the accomplishment of hitting each of these goals? So, for example, the average growth goal is one that approximately 50% of students will meet, and it is a realistic goal for most kids. However, it's not a growth goal that is likely to boost one's relative standing. So, a student who is a little bit below grade level, for example, if she or he were to make an average growth goal, they would continue to be a little bit below grade level. In order to boost their relative standing, they would have to show better than average growth. And so these other two options would be necessary in order for that goal to be achieved. A stretch growth of approximately 40% of students would meet or exceed this goal. It would help to increase one's relative standing, but it may not be sufficient depending on how far below grade level that student is starting out the school year. The custom growth goal in this particular case, we can see it was set to 13 points in the tool. This would approximately 31% of similar students would meet or exceed this level of growth, which is it's a very challenging goal and would have positive impact on a student's achievement. However, because it's a very difficult goal, we might want to consider whether there are sufficient resources in place to help the student reach this goal. So basically, I'm going to go back and I'm going to take us to the actual tool so that we can see what it looks like to interact with it. So I'm just going to go to the tool and I'm going to go right here. Here is the live tool. We can see that we can enter a state of residence. Oops, reset. Enter a state, and then when doing so, that information is taken into consideration when plotting the state proficiency mark, which we can see here. If the student were starting out a little bit higher, let's say that their fall grit score was 220, then the tool will adjust to show that the student is now above the national median, which we would see here because it shows that they're at the 76th percentile. We also show that the typical growth value which is 6 points for someone starting at that value, would be enough to put them on track for college readiness, but wouldn't be sufficient to put them on track for state proficiency in the state of California. So the information can be useful for helping to set growth goals that are aligned to getting these specific different benchmarks. So now I'm going to return to the slideshow from current, and I'm going to continue by talking about a third resource that is available to partners who work with NWEA, and this is what we call our Instructional Report. This is a little bit different from most of our reports in that most NWEA reports provide information about individual students' achievement or growth. What the Instructional Report does is it breaks down each individual student's test events into individual items. So all of the item responses for a given district are disassembled and then assembled to provide information about a student achievement at the level of individual learning topics or statements. So it doesn't provide information about individual students, but it provides aggregate information about all students within a given grade who are in terms of how they're performing with respect to specific instructional content. So it can be useful for identifying areas where there's overperformance or underperformance among students within a grade, and it can be used to identify areas where there are significant drops in performance for a cohort of students relative to prior years. So, for example, for our kids coming back to school after having been out all last spring, the Instructional Report could be used to see how their aggregate performance is on individual learning statements or topics relative to last year's cohort of same grade students. I'm going to show, and again, I'm going to do the same thing as I did last time. I'm going to show images from the report, and then I'm going to go back and show the live version. What we have here is a version. What we're seeing are information about student performance aggregated at the individual learning statements. Here we see it's taken from the instructional area measurement and data and from the sub-score area of geometric measurement and problem solving. And then we see individual learning statements. For example, comparing angle measurements to benchmark angles. We can see that the performance, these colors indicate where students are performing, overperforming or underperforming. We would expect, as Brad mentioned at the early in our session, map growth assessments are adjusting upwards and downwards in difficulty to hone in at the level of performance that each student is at right now, which means that in a typical adaptive test, students should be getting about 50% of their items correct. So we would expect that typical performance would be at about 50% correct. We can see here that kids are, the fifth graders in this district, they're overperforming on this particular, or so a little bit overperforming on this one, but they're underperforming on this particular one, completes complex conversions of customary units of length. So it can be used to identify relative shortcomings or areas of underperformance. So it could be used to identify content for instructional purposes, or it can be used by comparing last year across terms. You can look at the relative performance. In this case, we're looking at fall to spring, but we could look at, for example, a fall to fall and look at the fifth graders last year relative to the fifth graders this year and identify areas where last year's cohort of students were performing differently than this year's. And that could be used to identify instructional shortcomings. Before we go to that, I want to go to our actual report, though. If my hyperlink will work. Yes, it looks like it's working. And it's taking us straight there. So what I like about this is I can make it as broad or as finite as I want. So for example, say I wanted to look at my eighth graders and how they're performing only on topics that are aligned to eighth grade standards. So I'm going to filter those out, and I'm going to look at eighth graders, and I'm only going to look at a subset. So let's look at, for example, let's look at expressions and equations for eighth graders. And of all of those topics, let's look at exponents. And we don't have very much there. So let's look at something else. Let's look at number sentences. Okay, here we go. So now we're able to look at eighth grade standards, performance of eighth graders. You can see how they were doing in the fall, and then you can see how they're doing in the spring. So we've got approximately 50% correct, 58%. So they're actually showing a little bit of decrease or underperformance in spring relative to where they were in the fall. But we can see, for example, improvement in writing and solving two-step linear equations in spring relative to the prior fall. We could also use this to look at, like I said, differences across cohorts by doing like a fall to fall report and looking at last year's eighth graders relative to this year's eighth graders. So it's a way of identifying specific instructional content where we can see deficits or overperformance so that we can modify our instruction to make sure that we're focusing or targeting those areas of underperformance. So now I'm going to go back to the slide deck. But now we're at the point where we have time for questions. So I am going to go back and turn off my screen sharing so that we can see when people are stop sharing. And now I should be able to see everyone. Do we have any questions from the viewers?
How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
It helps when you turn mute off. You would think I've learned that by now with all the Zooming that we've done over the past several months. But I don't see any questions in the chat box just yet, and I don't know if the attendees have the ability to unmute or not in the session. I'm thinking they may not have it. So if you are an attendee and you do have a question, feel free to put that in the chat and we can address that. Mike, what I was talking about to myself apparently a minute ago was with the instructional report. As you were sharing info about that, I was thinking about the applications or various potential applications of that report in different contexts from a school or instructional leader perspective. And I was thinking along the lines of perhaps evaluating curriculum, if there may be any topics that are gaps in your curriculum, or maybe even if it's not perhaps a gap in the curriculum, but the instruction that you've provided on that topic is not appearing to be as effective as you would like it to be. Is that something that the instructional report might be able to help with?
Well, I think in so much as the instruction, the curriculum is focused on the specific learning content or learning statements that are identified in each of those areas,
Mm-hmm.
I think that what the way I see that is sort of a slide or an indicator of relative strength or relative weakness. So when I see areas where we've got lots of green, where it's in the high proportion correct, to me that's area that represents an area where performance is very strong. When we see high proportions of red, or areas where the percent correct are considerably below 50%, I would interpret those as areas where kids are underperforming relative to our expectations, given the adaptive nature of the test. And in some cases, like for example, if we restricted the content to say 8th grade standards and then looked at second graders' performance, you might expect to see a lot of lower performance if indeed kids got questions that targeted those specific areas. So I would want to consider or interpret the trends that I'm seeing in that report relative to the instructional content that I had provided beforehand, and interpret it relative to what had been provided. We wouldn't expect kids to do well on content if they've not received instruction. And so yes, I think you could look at changes in relative performance across cohorts, or within a cohort across different areas, to see what is best reflected in terms of their academic performance on the assessments, and if there are areas that seem to be relatively lower performing, that might be part of the curriculum to revisit or to focus on instruction on.
Thanks. Okay. Don't know if we've got any questions. I know it looks like we've still got 2 folks in the session. So I'm happy to stick around for the next 3 or 4 minutes just in case any questions do come up. And if when the timer gets down to 15 minutes, if we're still quiet, then I think we'll be safe to wrap things up and conclude the session.
We have a question from Jose. I appreciate this presentation. I believe it's important to be able to see these statistics. In the past, I've had to explain results in which I thought I myself as a teacher was explaining really well, and my students seemed to grasp. But when it comes to testing, however, results were completely different than my expectations. I think this is a good way to scaffold as well as to go back and see improvements. Well, I thank you for that comment, Jose. That's exactly what we hope, or that how we hope it can be used in this way, and we hope that it can be useful in exactly the way you suggest.
So I'm going to tag on to Mike's response, because of course this gets my brain turning and thinking about Jose, what you described, and using this to really look at the data to understand ways to scaffold. I think that is a really important concept, and if that's something that you're doing in your classroom or in your school, we would love to hear more about that, so we can share with some of our other partners. So feel free to reach out to your school's account manager if you want to chat about that more, or through the conferencing app, you can reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to chat with you about it, or get you connected with your school's account manager, and see how we can continue and grow and share the learning.